Crossroads of Twilight, Book 10 of The Wheel of Time. Written by Robert Jordan. Produced for Audio Renaissance by Books on Tape. And read by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding.
Dedication for Harriet, then, now, and always. And it shall come to pass, in the days when the dark hunt rides, when the right hand falters and the left hand strays, that mankind shall come to the crossroads of twilight, and all that is, all that was, and all that will be shall balance on the point of a sword, while the winds of the shadow grow. From the Prophecies of the Dragon, translation believed done by Jane Charin, known as Jane Farstrader, shortly before his disappearance. Prologue. Glimmers of the Pattern. Rodolaitoralda hated waiting, though he knew well it was the largest part of being a soldier. Waiting for the next battle, for the enemy to move, to make a mistake. He watched the winter forest and was as still as the trees. The sun stood halfway to his feet and gave no warning. His breath misted white in front of his face, frosting his neatly trimmed mustache and the black fox fur lining his hood. He was glad that his helmet hung at his pommel. His breastplate held the cold and radiated it through his coat and all the layers of wool, silk, and linen beneath. Even Dart's saddle felt cold, as though the white gelding were made of frozen milk. The helmet would have addled his brain. Winter had come late to Arad Doman, very late, but with a vengeance. From summer heat that lingered unnaturally into fall, to winter's heart in less than a month. The leaves that had survived the long summer's drought had been frozen before they could change color, and now they glistened like strange ice-covered emeralds in the morning sun. The horses of the 20-odd armsmen around him occasionally stamped a hoof in the knee-deep snow. It had been a long ride this far, and they had farther to go, whether this day turned out good or ill. Dark clouds roiled the sky to northward. He did not need his weather-wise there to tell him the temperature would plummet before nightfall. They had to be under shelter by then. "Not as rough as winter before last, is it, my lord?" Jollum said quietly. The tall young officer had a way of reading Aitoralda's mind, and his voice was pitched for the others to hear. "Even so, I suppose some men would be dreaming of mulled wine about now. Not this lot, of course.
Hey, Nick Blash, how you doing, bro?
They all drink tea, I believe.
Hope you're doing good.
Cold tea. If they had a few birch switches, they'd be stripping down for snow baths. They'll have to keep their clothes on for the time being," Aitoralda replied dryly. "But they might get some cold tea tonight, if they're lucky." That brought a few chuckles. Quiet chuckles. He had chosen these men with care, and they knew about noise at the wrong time. He himself could have done with a steaming cup of spiced wine or even tea, but it was a long time since merchants had brought tea to Arad Doman. A long time since.
How's your night going, Nick Blash?
Farther than the border of Saldea. By the time news of the outside world reached him, it was as still as last month's bread, if it was more than rumor to begin. That hardly mattered, though. If the White Tower truly was divided against itself, or men who could channel really were being called to Camelin, well, the world would have to do without Rodolaitoralda until Arad Doman was whole again. For the moment, Arad Doman was more than enough for any sane man to go on with. Once again he reviewed the orders he had sent, carried by the fastest riders he had, to every noble loyal to the king. Divided as they were by bad blood and old feud, they still shared that much. They would gather their armies and ride when orders came from the wolf. At least
Let's do a dab real quick, y'all.
They would even hide in the mountains and wait at his order. Oh, they would chafe, and some would curse his name, but they would obey. They knew the wolf won battles. More, they knew he won wars. The little wolf, they called it.
I think I could do one more dab out of my
He did not care.
Dr. Dabber before I gotta charge it.
Well, not much. So long as they rode when and where he said. Very soon they would be riding hard, moving to set a trap that would not spring for months. It was a long chance he was taking. Complex plans had many ways to fall apart, and this plan had layers inside layers. Everything would be ruined before it began if he failed to provide the bait, or if someone ignored his order to evade couriers from the king. They all knew his reasons, though, and even the most stiff-necked shared them, though few were willing to speak of the matter aloud. He himself had moved like a wraith racing on a storm since he received Al-Salam's latest command. In his sleeve, where the folded paper lay tucked above the pale lace that fell onto his steel-backed gauntlet. They had one last chance, one very small chance, to save Ar-Daman. Perhaps even to save Al-Salam from himself before the Council of Merchants decided to put another man on the throne in his place. He had been a good ruler for over 20 years.
Oh,
The
shit.
might send that he could be again.
That sucks,
The loud crack
Nitlash.
to the south sent Ituralda's hand to the hilt of his longsword.
And it's probably
There was a faint creak of leather
an indica and a sativa.
For the rest, silence.
It sounds like something a company would do. Release two strains, but make one a sativa and one an
After a
indica.
moment, he let himself relax, as much as he had relaxed since the tales came north of the Dragon Reborn appearing in the sky at Foma. Perhaps the man really was the Dragon Reborn. Perhaps he really had appeared in the sky. But whatever the truth, those tales had set Ar-Daman on fire. Ituralda was sure he could have put out that fire, given a freer hand. It was not boasting to think so. He knew what he could do with a battle, a campaign, a war. But ever since the council had decided the king would be safer smuggled out of Bandar Eban, Al-Salam seemed to have taken into his head that he was the rebirth of Arthur Hawkwing. His signature and seal had marked scores of battle orders since, floating out for more effort. They would not even to Ituralda himself. Everyone he confronted went flat-eyed and evasive at any mention of the king. He could almost believe they did not know where Al-Salam was. A ridiculous thought, of course. The council kept an unblinking eye on the king. Ituralda had always believed the merchant houses interfered too much, yet he wished they would interfere now. Why they remained silent was a mystery, for a king who damaged trade did not remain long on the throne. He was loyal to his oaths. Al-Salam was a friend, besides. But the orders the king sent could not have been better written to achieve chaos. Nor could they be ignored. Al-Salam was the king.
That's what that.
But he had
Much.
commanded Ituralda to march north with all possible
Because
speed
everyone's got to want to get a
that
Cheech and
Al-Salam's
Chong
supposed to
thing
be
just
north.
because
Then, 10 days later,
Cheech and Chong.
Dragon Sworn yet in sight, an order came to move south again, with all possible speed, against another gathering that never materialized. He had been commanded to concentrate his forces to defend Bandar Eban.
Hey, Boogie, how you doing?
And to divide them when a hammer blow could have done the same. To harry
Because
ground the Dragon Sworn had
me
abandoned,
and my
to march
brother
right
have tried
Words
that Cheech and
of
Chong
orders
strain.
often had gone directly to the powerful nobles who were
There's a
supposed
shop
to
down here that
sending Machir in
that
this
got
direction.
hold of
Deacle in that, Raman in the third.
Cheech and
Four
Chong
times
strain.
pitched battles had resulted from parts of the army blundering.
How you
into one
doing,
another at night,
Boogie?
while moving to
Hope
the
you're doing
king's
good
first
tonight,
and
or
expecting hundred
daytime,
enemies
depending where you're at.
And all the while, the Dragon Sworn gained numbers and confidence. Ituralda had had his triumphs at Salanja and Messine, at Lake Sobel, and Kandalmar. The lords of Qatar had learned of their mines and forges to the enemies of Ar-Daman. Always Al-Salam's orders
One
waged
second,
his
everyone.
gains. This last order was different, though. For one thing, the Grey Man had killed Lady Tuva trying to stop it from reaching him. Why the Shadow might fear this order more than any other was a mystery, yet it was all the more reason to move swiftly. Before Al-Salam reached him with another. This order opened many possibilities, and he had considered every last one he could see. But the good ones all started here, today. When small chances of success were all that remained, you had to seize them. A snow jay's strident cry rang out.
It's 11 p.m.
Then a second.
Oh, you're only an hour behind me, huh?
Cupping his hands around his mouth,
That's
Ituralda repeated
off.
3 harsh calls.
I got charged
Moments
this
later, a
again,
shaggy
so
tall dappled gelding appeared out of the trees, his rider in a white cloak streaked with
it's
black.
gonna be
Man and horse alike.
nectar
would have been
collector.
in the snowy forest had they been standing still. The rider pulled up beside Ituralda. A stocky man, he wore a single sword with a short blade, and there were a case bow and a quiver fastened to his saddle.
Oh shit.
Looks like they all came, my lord.
I actually got a
voice, pushing his cowl back
Cheech
from
and
his head.
Chong piece
Someone had
that I've had for a good minute. Watch, let me actually go get it.
What remained of his short-cropped hair was iron gray. The dark leather patch covering the socket of his right eye was a remnant of another youthful scrape. One eye or two, though, he was the best scout Ituralda had ever known. Most, anyways, he went on. They put 2 rings of sentries around the lodge, one inside the other. You can see them a mile off, but nobody will get close without them at the lodge hearing of it in time to get away. By the tracks, they didn't bring no more men than you said they could. Not enough to count. Of course, he added wryly, that still leaves you outnumbered a fair bit. Giralda nodded. He had offered the white ribbon, and the men he was to meet had accepted. 3 days when men pledged under the light by their souls in hope of salvation, not to draw a weapon against another or shed blood. The white ribbon had not been tested in this war, however, and these days some men had strange ideas of where salvation lay. Those who called themselves Dragonsworn, for instance. He had always been called a gambler, though he was not. The trick was in knowing what risks you could take, and sometimes in knowing which ones you had to take. Pulling a packet sewn into oiled silk from his boot top, he handed it to D'Angel. If I don't reach Corn Ford in 2 days, take this to my wife. The scout tucked the packet somewhere beneath his cloak, touched his forehead, and turned his
Let me
west.
just wipe it off
He
real
had
quick.
carried
It's
it
a little
right
dusty.
before, usually on the eve of battle. The light said this was not the time Tamsin would have to open that packet. She would come after him. She had told him so. The first incident ever of the living haunting the dead. Jalum, Giralda said, let us see what waits at Lady Osana's hunting lodge. As he heeled dart forward, the others fell in behind him. The sun rose to its height and began again to descend as they rode. The dark clouds in the north moved closer, and the chill bit deeper. There was no sound but the crunch of hooves breaking through the snow crust. The forest seemed empty, save for themselves. He did not see any of the sentries D'Angel had spoken of. The man's opinion of what could be seen from a mile differed from that of most. They would be expecting him, of course, and watching to make sure he was not followed by an army, white ribbon or no white ribbon. A good many of them likely had reasons they felt sufficient to feather Rodolite Giralda with arrows. A lord might pledge the white ribbon for his men, but would all of those feel bound? Sometimes there were chances you just had to take. About mid-afternoon, Osana's so-called hunting lodge loomed suddenly out of the trees, a mass of pale towers and slender, pointed domes that would have fitted well among the palaces of Bandareban itself.
No
She had
shit.
always been for men or power, her trophies numerous and noteworthy despite her relative youth, and the hunts that had taken place here would have raised eyebrows even in the capital. The lodge lay desolate now. Broken windows gaped like mouths with jagged teeth. None showed a glimmer of light or movement. The snow covering the cleared ground around the lodge had been well trampled by horses, however. The ornate, brass-bound gates of the main courtyard stood open, and he rode through without slowing, followed by his men. The horses' hooves clattered on the paving stones, where the snow had been beaten to slush. No servants came out to greet him, not that he had expected any. Osana had vanished early in the troubles that now shook Aradaman, like a dog shaking a rat, and her servants had drifted quickly to others of her house, taking whatever
this
places
up
they could
there.
find. These days, the masterless stars go
Try to get this clean.
dragon sworn. Dismounting in front of the broad marble stairway at the end of the courtyard, he handed Dart's reins to one of his armsmen, and Jalum ordered the men to take shelter where they could find it for themselves and the animals. Eyeing the marble balconies and wide windows that surrounded the
I'm gonna
courtyard,
have to use
they
my
noticed
big
the
torch
twisting
for it.
crossbow bolt between the shoulder blades. One set of stable doors
Oh,
stood
shit.
slightly ajar, but in spite of the cold, they divided themselves between the corners of the courtyard, huddling with the horses where they could keep watch in every direction. If the worst came, perhaps a few might make it out. Removing his gauntlets, he tucked them behind his belt and checked his lace as he climbed the stairs with Jalum. Snow that had been trodden underfoot and frozen again crackled beneath his boots.
Just
He
give me
refrained from
1
looking
second.
anywhere
It's
but
gonna
straight
get a
ahead.
little noisy.
He must appear supremely assured, as though there were no possibility events should go other than as he expected. Confidence was one key to victory. The other side believing you were confident was sometimes almost as good as actually being confident. At the head of the stairs, Jalum pulled open one of the tall carved doors by its gilded ring. Giralda touched his beauty spot with a finger to make sure it was in place. His cheeks were too cold to feel the velvet start quickly before he stepped inside, as self-assured as he would have been in a vault. The cavern or sentry hall was as icy as the outside. Their breath made feathered mists. Unlit, the space seemed already wreathed in twilight. The floor was a colorful mosaic of hunters and animals, the tiles chipped in places, as though heavy weights had been dragged over them, or perhaps dropped. Aside from a single toppled plinth that might once have held a large vase or a small statue, the hall was bare. What the servants had not taken when they fled had long since been looted by bandits. A single man awaited them, white-haired and more gaunt than when Giralda had last seen him. His breastplate was battered, and his earring was just a small gold hoop. But his lace was immaculate, and the sparkling red quarter moon beside his left eye would have gone well at court in better times. By the light, be welcome under the white ribbon, Lord Ituralda, he said formally with a slight bow. By the light, I come under the white ribbon, Lord Shimron, Ituralda replied, making his courtesy in return. Shimron had been one of Al-Salam's most trusted advisors, until he joined the Dragon Sworn at least. Now he stood high in their councils. My armsman is Jalam Nishur, honor-bound to House Ituralda, as are all who came with me. There had been no House Ituralda before Rodel, but Shimron answered Jalam's bow hand to heart. Honor be to honor. Will you accompany me, Lord Ituralda? He said as he straightened. The great doors to the ballroom were gone from their hinges, though Ituralda could hardly imagine bandits looting those. They left a tall, pointed arch, wide enough for 10 men to pass. Within the windowless oval room, 100 lanterns of every size and sort beat its shadows, but the light barely reached the dome ceiling. Separated by a wide expanse of floor, 2 groups of men stood against the painted walls. And if the white ribbon had induced them to leave off helmets, all 200 or more were armored otherwise. Certainly no one would put aside his swords. To one side were a few Damani lords as powerful as Shimron, Rajabi, Wakeda, and Kair, each surrounded by his cluster of lesser lords or sworn commodores, and smaller clusters, who was 2 or 3, many containing young nobles of all. The Dragon Sworn had councils, but no one commander. Still, each of those men was a leader in his own right, some thinking of followers and scrolls, few doing thousands. One appeared back to the people who was. One huge like theirs against the floor, Caravanus stood up. One solid mass against the fight. The Dragon Sworn
Nice and free.
Rodel almost smiled at the sight of the Outlanders, though. He had not dared to count on half so many appearing today.
Just tried to, anyways.
Lord Rodel Ituralda comes under the white ribbon, Shimron's voice. Let whoever may think of violence search his heart and consider his soul. Why does Lord Ituralda offer the white ribbon? Grown himself. Women had called him beautiful once. Now a slanting black scarf covered the socket of his missing right eye, and his beauty spot was a black arrowhead pointing at the thick scarf running from his cheek up onto his forehead. Does he intend to join us, or ask us to surrender? All know the wolf is bold as well as devious. Is he that bold? A rumble rose among the men on his side of the room, part mirth,
Gotta get
part
this
anger.
side now.
Ituralda clapped his hands.
Only you do them wrong.
Worse than our Saldaeans, and those ridiculous veils, they might as well wear masks. And the poor light from the lanterns did not help. But he had seen them veiled in mail, and he needed them. They have flooded onto Almouth Plain and moved ever north.
As long as you
Their
do
intent
it
is clear.
a nice
They mean to have our
mellow
Daman,
dab,
too.
you'd be alright.
They
But we
mean to
try
have
to
the
do
whole world, I fear.
big old monster dabs, yeah. Then they
Does Lord
hurt.
Ituralda want to know who we will support if these charlatans? Wakeda demanded. I have true faith you will fight for our Daman, Lord Wakeda, Ituralda said mildly. Wakeda went purple at having the direct insult flung in his teeth, and his oathmen's hands went to hilts. Refugees have brought word that there are Aiel on the plain now, Shimron put in quickly, as though he feared Wakeda might break the white ribbon. None of Wakeda's oathmen would draw steel unless he did, or commanded them to. They fight for the dragon reborn, so say the reports. He must have sent them, perhaps as an aid to us. No one has ever defeated an Aiel army, not even Otter Hawkwing. You recall the Blood Snow, Lord Ituralda, when we were younger? I believe you agree with me that we did not defeat them there, whatever the histories may say. And I cannot believe the Shonchen have the numbers we did then. I myself have heard of Shonchen moving south, away from the border. No, I suspect the next we hear will be of them retreating from the plain, not advancing on us. He was not a bad commander in the field, but he had always been pedantic. Ituralda smiled. Word came more swiftly from the south than from anywhere else, but he had been afraid he would have to bring up the Aiel, and they might have thought he was trying to trick them. He could hardly believe it himself. Aiel on Ulmouth Plain. He did not point out that Aiel sent to help the Dragonsworn were more likely to have appeared in Aradaman itself. I've questioned refugees too, and they speak of Aiel raids, not armies. Whatever the Aiel are doing on the plain may have slowed the Shonchen, but it hasn't turned them back. Their flying beasts have begun scouting on our side of the border. That does not smack of retreat. Producing the paper from his sleeve with a flourish, he held it up so all could see the sword in hand impressed in green and blue wax. As always of late, he had used a hot blade to separate the royal seal on one side while leaving it whole, so he could show it unbroken to doubters. There had been plenty of those when they heard some of Al-Salam's orders. I have orders from King Al-Salam to gather as many men as I can, from wherever I can find them, and strike as hard as I can at the Shonchen. He took a deep breath.
Get your lungs
Here,
clear.
he took another chance. He had his head on the block unless the dice fell the right way. I offer a truce. I pledge in the king's name not to move against you in any way, so long as the Shonchen remain a threat to Aradaman. If you will all pledge the same and fight beside me against them until they are beaten back. A stunned silence answered him. Bullneck Rajabi appeared poleaxed. Wakeda chewed his lip like a startled girl. Then Shimron muttered, "Can they be beaten back, Lord Ituralda? I faced their chained Aes Sedai on Ulmouth Plain, as did you." Boots scraped the floor as men shifted their feet and faces darkened in bleak anger. No man liked to think he was helpless before an enemy, but enough had been there in the early days.
Yeah, I would miss it too.
Ituralda and Shimron for all to know what this enemy was like. They can be defeated, Lord Shimron, Ituralda replied, even with their little surprises. A strange thing to call the earth erupting under your feet, and scouts that rode what looked like shadow spawn, but he had to sound assured as well as look it. Besides, when you knew what the enemy could do, you adapted. That had been one core of warfare long before the Shonchen appeared. Darkness cut the Shonchen advantages, and so did storms, and a weatherwise could always tell you when a storm was coming. A wise man stops chewing when he reaches bone, he continued, but so far the Shonchen have had their meat sliced thin before they reached for it. I intend to give them a tough shank to gnaw. More, I have a plan to make them snap so fast they'll break their teeth on bone before they have a mouthful of meat. Now, I have pledged. Will you? It was hard not to hold his breath. Each man seemed to be looking inward. He could all but see them mulling it over. The wolf had a plan.
I don't know if I
Shonchen
can
had
stop
chained Aes
smoking.
Sedai and flying beasts.
As long
and
as I
none alone knew
smoke.
what else. But the wolf had a plan. The Shonchen, the wolf. If any man can defeat them, Shimron said finally, you can, Lord Ituralda. I will so pledge. I do so pledge, Rajabi shouted. We'll chase them back across the ocean where they came from. He had a bull's temperament as well as its neck. Surprisingly, Wakeda thundered his agreement with equal enthusiasm, and then a storm of voices broke, calling that they would match the king's pledge, that they would smash the Shonchen, even some that they would follow the wolf into the pit of doom. All very gratifying, but not all Ituralda had come for. If you ask us to fight for Aradaman, one voice chattered above the rest, then ask us. The men who had been calling their pledges fell to angry mutters and half-heard curses. Hiding his pleasure behind a bland expression, Ituralda turned to face the speaker.
Oh shit,
The other
damn,
side
that
of the room.
sucks.
The Tarabanner was a lean man, with a sharp nose that made a tent of his veil. His eyes were hard, though, and keen. Some of the other Tarabanners frowned as if displeased he had spoken, so it appeared they had no one leader any more than the Domani. But he had spoken. Ituralde had hoped for the pledges he had received, but they were not necessary to his plan. The Tarabanners were. At least, they would make it 100 times more likely to work. He addressed the man courteously with a bow. I offer you the chance to fight for Taraban, my good lord. The Aiel are making some confusion on the plain. The refugees speak of it. Tell me, could a small company of your men, 100, perhaps 2, cross the plain in that disorder and enter Taraban, if their armor was marked with stripes, as those who ride for the Shonchan? It seemed impossible the Tarabanner's face could grow any tighter, yet it did, and it was the turn of the men on his side of the room to mutter angrily and curse. Enough word had come north for them to know of a king and Panarch put on their thrones by the Shonchan, and swearing fealty to an empress on the other side of the Arath Ocean. They could not like reminders of how many of their countrymen now rode for this empress. Most of the Shonchan on Almouth Plain were Tarabanners. What good could one small company do? The lean man growled, contemptuous. Little good, Ituralde replied. But if there were 50 such companies, 100. These Tarabanners might have that many men behind them, all told. If they all struck on the same day, all across Taraban, I myself would ride with them, and as many of my men as can be outfitted in Tarabanner armor. Just so you will know, this is not simply a stratagem to get rid of you. Behind him, the Domani began protesting loudly.
Well, that's a long time without smoking.
The wolf's plan was all
Boogie.
very well, but they wanted the wolf himself at their head. Most of the Tarabanners began arguing among themselves over whether so many men could cross the plain without being discovered, even in such small bands, over what good, if any, they could do in Taraban in small companies, over whether they were willing to wear armor marked with Shonchan stripes. Tarabanners argued as easily as Saldeans, and as hotly. Not the sharp-nosed man. He met Ituralde's gaze steadily, then gave a slight nod. It was hard to tell behind those thick mustaches, but Ituralde thought he smiled. The last tension faded from Ituralde's shoulders. The fellow would not have agreed while the others argued, if he were not more of a leader among them than he seemed.
Give me
The others
1
would
second,
come too,
everyone.
he was certain. They would ride south with him into the heart of what the Shonchan considered their own, and slap them hard and full across the face. The Tarabanners would want to stay afterward, of course, and continue the fight in their own homeland. He could not expect anything more, which would leave him and the few thousand men he could take with him to be hounded back north again, all the long way across Almouth Plain. If the light shone on him, hounded with fury. He returned the Tarabbanner's smile, if smile it was. With any luck, furious generals would not see where he was leading them until it was too late. And if they did, well, he had a second plan. Demon Volga held his cloak tight around himself as he tramped through the snow among the trees. Cold and steady, the wind sighed through the snow-laden branches, a deceptively quiet sound in the damp gray light. It sliced through the thick white wood as through gall, chilling him to the bone. The camp sprawling around him through the forest was too quiet. Movement provided a little warmth, but in this, men huddled together unless driven to move. Abruptly, he stopped in his tracks, wrinkling his nose at a sudden stench, a gagging foulness like 20 midden heaps crawling with maggots. He did not gag. Instead, he scowled. The camp lacked the precision he preferred. The tents were clustered haphazardly, wherever the limbs overhead grew thickest, the horses tethered close by, rather than properly picketed. It was the sort of slackness that led to filth. Unwatched, the men would bury horse dung under a few shovels of dirt to be done with it quicker, and dig latrines where they would not have to walk far in the cold. Any officer of his who allowed that would cease to be an officer, and learn firsthand how to use a shovel. He was scanning the camp for the source of the smell, when suddenly there was no smell. The wind did not change. The stink just vanished. He was startled for only a moment. Walking on, he scowled all the harder. The stench had come from somewhere. He would find whoever thought discipline had slackened and make examples of them. Discipline had to be tight now, tighter than ever. At the edge of a broad clearing, he paused again. The snow in the clearing was smooth and unmarked, despite the camp hidden all around it. Staying back among the trees, he scanned the sky. Scudding gray clouds hid the noonday sun. A flicker of motion made his breath catch before he realized it was just a bird, some small brown thing, wary of hawks and staying low. He barked a laugh that was more than touched with bitterness. Little more than a month since the light-cursed Shonshen had swallowed Amador and the Fortress of Light in one unbelievable gulp. But he had learned new instincts. Wise men learned, while fools... Alron had been a fool, puffed up with old tales of glory, brightened by age and new hope of winning real power to go with his crown. He refused to see the reality in front of his eyes, and Alron's disaster had been the result. Balda had heard it named the Battle of Jeramel, but only by some of the bare handful of Amadisian nobles who escaped, dazed as poleaxed steers, yet still trying mechanically to put the best face on events. He wondered what Alron had called it when the Shonshan's tame witches began tearing his orderly ranks to bloody rags. He could still see that in his head, the earth turning to fountains of fire. He saw it in his dreams. Well, Alron was dead, cut down trying to flee the field, and his head displayed on a Tarabana's lance. A suitable death for him. He, on the other hand, had over 9,000 of the children gathered around him. A man who saw clearly could make much out of that in times like these. On the far side of the clearing, just inside the tree line, was a rude house that had once belonged to a charcoal burner, a single room with winter-brown weeds thick in the gaps between the stones. By all appearances, the man had abandoned the place some time ago. Parts of the thatch roof sagged dangerously, and whatever had once filled the narrow windows was long since gone, replaced now by dark blankets. 2 guards stood beside the ill-fitting wooden door, big men with the scarlet shepherd's crook behind the golden sun flare on their cloaks. They had their arms wrapped around themselves and were stamping their boots against the cold. Neither could have reached his sword in time to do any good. Had Balda been an enemy. Questioners liked to work indoors. Their faces might have been carved stone as they watched him approach. Neither offered more than a half-hearted salute. Not for a man without the shepherd's crook, even if he was Lord Captain Commander of the Children. One opened his mouth as if to question Balda's purpose, but Balda walked by them and pushed open the rough door. At least they did not try to stop him. He would have killed them both if they had. At his entrance, Asinawa looked up from the crooked table where he was perusing a small book, one bony hand cupped around a steaming pewter cup that gave off the odor of spices. His ladder-backed chair, the only other piece of furniture in the room, appeared rickety, but someone had strengthened it with rawhide lashings. Balda tightened his mouth to stop a sneer. The High Inquisitor of the Hand of the Light demanded a real roof, not a tent, even if it was thatched sorely in need of patching, and mulled wine when no one else had tasted wine of any sort in a week. A small fire burned on the stone hearth, too, giving a meager warmth. Even cook fires had been banned since before the disaster, to prevent smoke giving them away. Still, although most children despised the questioners, they held Asinawa in a strange esteem, as if his gray hair and gaunt martyr's face graced him with all the ideals of the Children of the Light. That had been a surprise when Balda first learned of it. He was unsure whether Asinawa himself knew. In any case, there were enough questioners to make trouble. Nothing he could not handle, but it was best to avoid that sort of trouble. For now. It is almost time, he said, shutting the door behind him. Are you ready? Asinawa made no move to rise or reach for the white club folded across the table beside him. There was no sun flare on that, just the scarlet crook. Instead, he folded his hands over the book, hiding the pages. Balda thought it was Mantelar's The Way of the Light. Odd reading for the High Inquisitor, more suited to new recruits. Those who could not read when they swore were taught so they could study Mantelar's words. I have reports of an Andoran army in Murandi, my son, Asinawa said. Deep in Murandi, perhaps. Murandi is a long way from here, Balda said, as though he did not recognize an old argument starting anew, an argument that Asinawa often seemed to forget he had already lost. But what were Andorans doing in Murandi? If the reports were true, so many were travelers' fantasies wrapped in lies. Andor, the very name rankled in Balda's memory. Morghese was dead, or else a servant to some Shonshan. They had little respect for titles other than their own. Dead or a servant, she was lost to him, and more important by far, his plans for Andor were lost. Galadrid had gone from a useful lover to just another young officer, and one who was too popular with the common soldiers. Good officers were never popular, but Balda was a pragmatic man. The past was the past. New plans had replaced Andor. Not so far if we move east across Altara, my son. Across the north of Altara. The Shonchan cannot have moved far from Adar yet. Spreading his hands to catch the hearth fire's small warmth, Bald sighed. It spread like a plague in Terabon, and here in Amadisia. Why did the men think Altara was different? Are you forgetting the witches in Altara? With an army of their own, need I remind you? Unless they're into Murundi by now. Those reports he believed, of the witches on the move. In spite of himself, his voice rose. Maybe this so-called Andoran army you've heard about is the witches and their army. They gave Camelin to Althor, remember? And Ilion, and half the east. Do you really believe the witches are divided? Do you? Slowly, he drew a deep breath, calming himself. Trying to. Every tale out of the east was worse than the last. A gust of wind down the chimney blew sparks into the room, and he stepped back with a curse. Bloody peasant hovel. Even the chimney was ill-made. Asunawa snapped the small book shut between his palms. His hands were folded as in prayer, but his deep-set eyes suddenly seemed hotter than the fire. I believe the witches must be destroyed. That is what I believe. I'd settle for knowing how the Shonchan tamed them. With enough tame witches, he could drive Althor out of Andor, out of Ilion, and everywhere else he had settled like the shadow itself. He could better Hawkling himself. They must be destroyed, Asunawa asserted stubbornly. And us with them, Balder demanded. A knock came at the door, and at Asunawa's curt summons, one of the guards from outside appeared in the doorway, standing rigidly erect, arms snapping across his chest in a crisp salute. My Lord High Inquisitor, he said respectfully, the Council of the Anointed is here. Balder waited. Would the old fool continue to be stubborn with all 10 surviving lords captain outside, mounted and ready to ride? What was done was done. What had to be done. If it brings down the White Tower, Asunawa said finally, I can be content. For now. I will come to this meeting. Balder smiled thinly. Then I am content. We will see the witches fall together. Certainly, he would see them fall. I suggest you have your horse readied. We have a long way to ride by nightfall. Whether Asunawa would see it with him was another matter.
Gabriella enjoyed her rides through the wintry woods with Loghain and Tovann. He always let Tovann and her follow at their own pace in a semblance of privacy, so long as they did not lag too far behind. The two Aes Sedai seldom spoke more than absolutely necessary, though, even when they truly were private. They were far from friends. In fact, Gabriella often wished Tovann would ask to stay behind when Loghain offered these outings. It would have been very pleasant to be really alone. Holding her reins in one green-gloved hand and keeping her fox-lined cloak shut with the other, she let herself feel the cold, just a little, just for the refreshing vigor of it. The snow was not deep, but the morning air was crisp. Dark gray clouds promised more snow soon. High overhead flew a long-winged bird of some sort. An eagle, perhaps. Birds were not her strong point. Plants and minerals stayed in one place while you studied them, and so did books and manuscripts, though those might crumble under her fingers if they were old enough. She could barely make the bird out at that height in any case, but an eagle fit the landscape. Woodland surrounded them, small dense thickets dotted among more widely spaced trees. Great oaks and towering pines and firs had killed off most of the undergrowth, though here and there the thick brown remains of a hardy vine, waiting for a still distant spring, clung to a boulder or a low gray ledge of stone. She carefully held that landscape in her mind like a novice exercise, chill and empty. With no one in sight except her two companions, she could almost imagine she was somewhere other than the Black Tower. That horrid name came all too easily to mind now. A thing as real as the White Tower, and no longer so called for anyone who laid eyes on the great stone barracks buildings that held hundreds of men in training, and the village that had grown up around them. She had lived in that village for nearly 2 weeks, and there were parts of the Black Tower she still had not seen. Its grounds covered miles, surrounded by the beginnings of a wall of black stone. Still, she could almost forget, here in the woods. Almost. Except for the bundle of sensation and emotion, the essence of Logain Atlar that always rode in the back of her mind, a constant feel of controlled wariness, of muscles always on the edge of tensing. A hunting wolf might feel that way, or perhaps a lion. The man's head moved constantly. Even here he watched his surroundings as though expecting attack. She had never had a warder. They were needless flamboyants for Browns. A hired servant could do all she needed, and it felt peculiar to be not only part of a bond, but at the wrong end of it, so to speak. Worse than simply the wrong end. This bond required her to obey, and she was hedged about with prohibitions. So it was not the same as a warder bond, really. Sisters did not force their warders to obedience. Well, not very often. And sisters had not bonded men against their will for centuries. Still, it did provide a fascinating study. She had worked at interpreting what she sensed. At times, she could almost read his mind. Other times, it was like fumbling through a mine shaft with no lamp. She supposed she would try to study if her neck were stretched on the head's north block, which, in a very real way, it was. He could sense her as well as she could him. She must always remember that. Some of the Ashaman might believe the Aes Sedai were resigned to their captivity, but only a fool could think 51 sisters who had been forcibly bonded would all embrace resignation, and Logain was no fool. Besides, he knew they had been sent to destroy the Black Tower. Yet, if he suspected that they were still trying to find a way to end the threat of hundreds of men who could channel light, constrained as they were, one order could halt them in their tracks. You will do nothing to harm the Black Tower. She could not understand why that command had not been given as a simple precaution. They must succeed. Fail, and the world was doomed. Logain turned in his saddle, an imposing, broad-shouldered figure in a well-trained coat, dark as pitch, without a touch of color, save for the silver sword and the red and gold dragon on his high collar. His black cloak was thrown back, as though he were refusing to let the cold touch him. He might be. These men seemed to believe they had to fight everything all the time. He smiled at her, reassuringly, and she blinked. Had she let too much anxiety slip into her end of the bond? It was such a delicate dance, trying to control her emotions, to present just the right responses. It was almost like taking the test for the show, where every weave had to be made exactly so, without the slightest falter, despite every manner of distraction. Only this test went on and on and on. He turned his attention on Tovain, and Gabriella exhaled.
Be right back,
Just a
everyone.
smile, a companionable gesture. He was often congenial. He might have been likable if he were anything but what he was. Tovain beamed back at him, and Gabriella had to stop herself from shaking her head in wonderment, not for the first time. Pulling her hood a little forward as though against the cold, so it sheltered her face while giving her an edge to peek around, she studied the red sister surreptitiously. Everything she knew of the other woman said she buried her hates in shallow graves, if at all, and Tovain loathed men who could channel as deeply as any red Gabriella had ever met. Any red must despise Logain Adlar, after the claims he had made that the Red Aja itself had set him up to become a false dragon. He might be holding his silence now, but the damage was done. There were sisters captive with them who looked at Reds as though thinking they, at least, were caught in the trap of their making. Yet Tovain all but simpered at him. Gabriella bit her underlip in perplexed thought. True, Cassandra and Lamai had ordered everyone to achieve cordial relations with the Ashaman who held their bonds. The men must be lulled before the sisters could do anything useful. But Tovain bristled openly at every command from either sister. She had detested yielding to them, and might have refused if Lamai were not also red, no matter that she had admitted it must be so. or that no one had recognized her authority once she led them into captivity. She hated that, too. Yet that was when she had begun smiling at Logain. For that matter, how could Logain sit at the other end of her bond and take that smile as anything but fraud? Gabriella had picked at that knot before, too, without coming close to untying it. He knew too much about Tauvain. Knowing her Aja should have been enough. Yet Gabriella felt as little suspicion in him when he looked at the Red Sister as when he looked at her. He was hardly free of suspicion. The man was distrustful of everyone, it seemed, but less of any sister than of some Ashaman. That made no sense either. He's no fool, she reminded herself. So why? And why for Tauvain as well? What is she scheming at? Abruptly, Tauvain flashed that seemingly warm smile at her and spoke as if she had voiced at least one of her questions aloud. With you near, she murmured in a mist of breath, he's barely aware of me. You've made him your captive, sister. Caught by surprise, Gabriella flushed in spite of herself. Tauvain never made conversation, and to say she disapproved of Gabriella's situation with Logain was to understate drastically. Seducing him had seemed such an obvious way to get close enough to learn his plans, his weaknesses. After all, even if he was an Ashaman, she had been Aes Sedai long before he was born, and she was hardly a total innocent when it came to men. He had been so surprised when he realized what she was doing that she almost thought of him as the innocent. More fool she. Playing the Damani turned out to hide many surprises and a few pitfalls. Worst of all, a trap she could never reveal to anyone. Something she very much feared that Tauvain knew, though, at least in part. But then any sister who had followed her lead must know too, and she thought several had. None had spoken of the problem, and none was likely to, of course. Logain could mask the bond, in a crude way she believed would still allow her to find him, however well it hid his emotions. But sometimes when they shared a pillow, he let the masking slip. To say the least, the results were devastating. There was no calm restraint then, no cool study, not much of reason at all. Hurriedly she summoned the image of the snowy landscape again and fixed it in her mind. Trees and boulders and smooth white snow. Smooth, cold snow. Logain did not look back at her or give any outward sign, but the bond told her that he was aware of her momentary loss of control. The man brimmed with smugness and satisfaction. It was all she could do not to seethe. But he would expect her to seethe, burn him. He had to know what she felt from him. Letting her anger rise, though, only filled the fellow with amusement, and he was not even attempting to hide it. Tauvain was wearing a small, satisfied smile, Gabriella noticed, but she had only a moment to wonder why. They had had the morning to themselves, but now another
Let's
rider
do a
appeared
cold
from the
start.
trees, a cloakless man in black, who angled his horse in their direction when he saw them and dug his boot heels into his animal's flanks for speed, despite the snow. Logain reined in to wait, the image of calm, and Gabriella stiffened as she halted her mount beside him. The feelings carried by the bond had shifted. Now they were the tension of a wolf waiting to spring. She expected to see his gauntleted hands on his sword hilt, rather than resting at ease on the tall pommel of his saddle. The newcomer was almost as tall as Logain, with waves of golden hair to his wide shoulders, and a winning smile. She suspected he knew it was a winning smile. He was too pretty not to know, much more beautiful than Logain. Ice forges had hardened Logain's face and rough edges. This young man was smooth in it. Still, the sword and the dragon decorated his coat collar. He studied the two sisters with bright blue eyes. Are you betting both of them, Logain? He said in a deep voice. The plump one looks cold-eyed to me, but the other appears warm enough. Tauvain hissed angrily, and Gabriella's jaw clenched. She had made no real secret of what she did. She was no Kyrianan to cloak in privacy what she was ashamed of in public, but that did not mean she expected to have it bantered about. Worse, the man spoke as though they were tavern light skirts. Don't ever let me hear that again, Miss Ryan, Logan said quietly, and she realized the bond had changed again. It was cold now, cold to make the snow seem warm, cold to make the grave seem warm. She had heard that name before, Atal Mishraila, and felt distrust in Logain when he spoke it, certainly more than he felt for her or Tovain, but this was the feel of killing. It was almost laughable. The man held her prisoner, yet he was ready to do violence to defend her reputation. Part of her did want to laugh, but she tucked the
Damn it.
information away. Any scrap might be useful. The younger fellow gave no sign of hearing a threat. His smile never faltered. The Mahale says you can go if you want. Can't see why you'd want to take on recruiting. Someone has to, Logan replied in a level tone. Gabriella exchanged puzzled glances with Tovain. Why would Logan want to go recruiting? They'd seen men beating the drum for the Dragon Reborn did not always get the work
No.
done, it seemed. Even before anyone learned what they were really after. Why was she and Tovain just hearing of it? She would have sworn he told her everything. Before I shrugged. Plenty of dedicated
That was a good one
soldiers
there.
to do that sort of work. Of course, I suppose it bores you looking after training all the time. Teaching fools to sneak around in the woods and climb cliffs as if they couldn't channel a whisper. Might look better. His smile slid into a smirk, disdainful and not at all winning. Maybe if you ask the Mahale, he'll let you join his classes at the palace. You wouldn't be bored then. Logain's face never changed, but Gabriella felt one sharp bolt of fury through the bond. She'd overheard tidbits about Mazrim Taim and his private classes, but all any of us knew was that Logain and his cronies did not trust Taim or any who attended his lessons, and Taim appeared not to trust Logain. Unfortunately, what the sisters could learn of the classes was limited. One was bonded to a Some thought the mistrust was because both men had claimed to be the Dragon Reborn, or even a sign of the madness that channeling brought to men. She had not detected any evidence of insanity in Logain, and she watched for it as hard as she watched for signs he was about to channel. If she were still bound to him when he went mad, it might seize her mind too. Whatever caused a crack in the Ashaman's ranks must be exploited, though. Mishraila's smile faded as Logain merely looked at him. Enjoy your fly specks, he said finally, pulling his horse around. A thud of his heel made the animal spring away as he called over his shoulder, Glory waits for some of us, Logain. He may not enjoy his dragon long, Logain murmured, watching the other man gallop off. He's too free with his tongue. She did not think he meant the comment about her and Tovain, but what else could he mean? And why was he suddenly worried? Hiding it very well, especially considering the bond, but still he was worried. Light. Sometimes it seemed that knowing what was in a man's head made the confusion worse. Abruptly, he turned his gaze on her and Tovain, studying. A new thread of concern slipped through the bond. About them? Or, an odd thought, for them? I fear we must cut short our ride, he said after a moment. I have preparations to make. He did not break into a gallop, but he still set a quicker pace back toward the village of the men in training than he had coming out. He was concentrating on something now, thinking hard, Gabriella suspected. The bond practically hummed with it. He must have been riding by instinct. Before they had gone very far, Tovain moved her horse close to Gabriella's. Leaning in her saddle, she tried to fix Gabriella with an intent stare, while darting quick glances at Logain as if afraid he might look back and see them talking. She never seemed to pay attention to what the bond told her. The divided effort made her bob about like a puppet, in danger of falling. We must go with him, the Red whispered. Whatever it takes, you must see to it. Gabriella raised her eyebrows, and Tovanne had the grace to color, but she lost sight of her emotions. We cannot afford to be left behind, she breathed hurriedly. The man didn't abandon his ambitions when he came here. Whatever vileness he plans, we can do nothing if we aren't right there when he tries. I can see what's in front of my nose, Gabriella said sharply, and felt relief when Tovanne simply nodded and fell silent. It was all Gabriella could do to control the fear that was rising in her. Did Tovanne never think about what she must sense through the bond? Something that had always been there in the connection with Logain, determination, now lay hard and sharp as a knife. She thought she knew what it meant this time, and knowing made her mouth dry. Against whom she could not say, but she was sure that Logain Ablar was riding to war. Slowly descending one of the wide hallways that spiraled gently through the white tower, Mary felt prickly as a starved cat. She could barely make herself listen to what the sister gliding beside her was saying. The morning was still dim, first light darkened by the snow falling heavily on Tar Valon, and the middle levels of the tower were as icy as a borderland winter. Well, perhaps not so cold as that, she allowed after a moment. She had not been that far north in a number of years, and memory expanded what it did not shrink. That was the reason written records were so important, except when you did not dare write down anything, at least. Still, it was chill enough. For all the ancient builders' cleverness and skill, heat from the great furnaces in the basement never reached this high. Drafts made the flames dance on the gilded stand lamps, and some were strong enough to stir the heavy tapestries spaced along the white walls. Spring flowers and woodlands and exotic animals and birds, alternating with scenes of tower triumphs that would never be displayed in the public areas below. Her own rooms, with their warm fireplaces, would once have been much more comfortable. News from the outside world churned through her head despite her efforts to avoid it. Or rather, more often, the lack of solid news. What eyes and ears reported from Altara and Arad Doman was all confusion, and the few reports beginning to seep out of Tarabon again were frightening. Rumor put the borderland rulers everywhere from the Blight to Andor to Amadisia to the Aiel Waste. The only confirmed fact was that none were where they were supposed to be, guarding the Blight border. The Aiel were everywhere, and finally out of Althor's control, it appeared, if they had ever been in it. The latest news from Murundi made her want to grind her teeth and weep at the same time, while Kyrian, sisters all over the Sun Palace, some suspected of being rebels and none known to be loyal, and still no word of Coirin and her embassy since they departed the city, though they should have been back in Tar Valon long since. And as if that were not enough, Althor himself had vanished like a soap bubble yet again. Could the tales that he had half destroyed the Sun Palace be true? Light, the man could not go mad yet. Or had Elida's ruthless offer of protection frightened him into hiding? Did anything frighten him? He frightened her. He frightened the rest of the hall, too. Let them put whatever face on it they wanted. The only thing truly certain was that none of that mattered a spit in a rainstorm. Knowing so did not help her mood in the slightest. Worry over being caught in a tangle of roses, even if the thorns might kill you eventually, was a luxury when you had a knife point pressed to your ribs. Every time she's left the tower in the last 10 years, it has been on her own affairs, so there are no recent records to check, her companion murmured. It's difficult to learn exactly when she has been out of the tower and remain discreet. Her dark golden hair held back by ivory combs, Maidani was tall and slender enough to look overbalanced by her bosom, an effect emphasized by both the fit of her dark silver-embroidered bodice and the way she walked in a stoop to put her mouth more on the level of Yukiri's ear. Her shawl was caught on her wrists, the long gray fringe dragging the floor tiles. Straighten your backbone, Yukiri growled quietly. My ears aren't clogged with dirt. The other woman jerked herself upright, faint splashes of color in her cheeks. Pulling her shawl higher on her arms, Maidani half glanced over her shoulder toward her warder, Leonin, who was following at a discreet distance. If they could barely hear the faint tinkle of the silver bells in the lean man's black braids, though, he could hear nothing said in a moderate tone. The man knew no more than necessary, precious little, in fact, except that his Aes Sedai wanted certain things of him. That was enough for any good warder. And he might cause problems if he learned too much. But there was no need for whispering. People who saw whispering wanted to know what the secret was. The other gray was no more the source of her irritation than the outside world, however, even if the woman was a jackdaw in swan's feathers. Not the main source, anyway. A disgusting thing, demanding loyalty. Yet Yukiri was actually glad that Sayarin and Pavara had convinced her that they should not yet turn Maidani and her sister jackdaws over to Tower Law. Their wings were clipped now, and they were useful. They might even gain a measure of clemency for when they did face justice. Of course, when the oath that had clipped Maidani's wings came out, Yukiri might easily find herself wishing for clemency herself. Rebels or not, what she and the others had done with Maidani and her confederates was as far outside the law as murder or treason. An oath of personal obedience, sworn on the oath rod itself, sworn under duress, was all too close to compulsion, which was clearly prohibited if not really defined. Still, sometimes you had to smudge the plaster to smoke out hornets, and the Black Aja were hornets with venomous stings. The law would have its course in due time. Without the law there was nothing, but she needed to be more concerned with whether she would survive the smoking out than with what penalties the law would exact. Corpses had no need to worry about punishment. She motioned curtly for Maidani to go on, but no sooner had the other woman opened her mouth than 3 browns rounded a corner from another hallway right in front of them, flaunting their shawls like greens. Yukiri knew Maris Thornhill and Dore's Messiano slightly, in the manner suitors knew sisters from other Ajas who spent long periods in the tower, which was to say enough to attach names to faces and not much more. Mild and absorbed in their studies was how she would have described them, if pressed. Ellen Worrell was so newly raised to the shawl, she still should have been bobbing curtsies on instinct. Instead of offering courtesies to a sitter, though, all 3 stared at Yukiri and Maidani the way cats stared at strange dogs, or maybe dogs at strange cats. No mildness there. "May I ask about a point of our felon-law, sitter?" Maidani said, as smoothly as if that were what she had been intending to say all along. Yukiri nodded, and Maidani began rambling about fishing rights on rivers versus lakes, hardly an inspired choice.
Oh, this chair's...
A magistrate might ask an Aes Sedai to listen to a case of fishing rights, but only to bolster her own opinion if powerful people were involved, and she was worried about an appeal to the throne. A single warder trailed the Browns. Yukiri could not recall whether he belonged to Maris or Dore's. A heavy-set fellow with a hard, round face and a dark topknot, who eyed Leonin and the swords on his back with the distrust surely picked up from his sister. That pair stalked by up the slowly spiraling corridor with plump chins high, the skinny newling leaping anxiously to keep up. The warder strode after them, radiating the air of a man in hostile country. Hostility was all too usual nowadays. The invisible walls between the Ajas, once barely thick enough to hide each Aja's own mysteries, had
Yeah,
become
didn't heat
hard
up good
stone
enough.
ramparts with moats. No, not moats. Chasms, deep and wide. Sisters never left their own Aja's quarters alone, often took their warders even to the library training rooms, and always wore their shawls, as though someone might mistake their Aja otherwise. Yukiri herself was wearing her best, embroidered in silver and thread of gold, with the long silk fringe that hung to her ankles. So she supposed she was flaunting her Aja a bit too, and lately she had been considering that a dozen years was long enough to go without a warder. A horrible thought, once she sifted out the source. No sister should have need of a warder inside the White Tower. Not for the first time, the thought hit her hard that someone had to mediate among them, and soon the rebels would dance in through the front door calling and empty the house. The rest of them squabbled over who got Great Aunt Sumi's pewter. But the only end of the thread she could see to begin working out the snarl was to have Maidani and her friends publicly admit that they had been sent to the tower by the rebels to spread rumors. Tales they still insisted were true, that the Red Aja had created a false dragon. Without Pavara knowing? Impossible to think that a sitter, especially Pavara, could have been fooled. In any case, that bit of the tangle had been overlaid with so many others by now that it scarcely could make any difference by itself. Besides, it would throw away the aid of 10 out of the 14 women she could be sure were not Black Aja, not to mention likely exposing what the rest of them were doing before the storm over it blew out. She shivered, and it had nothing to do with draft. She and every other woman who might reveal the truth would die before that storm ended, by so-called accident or in bed. Or she might just vanish, apparently gone out of the tower, never to be seen again. She had no doubt of that. Any evidence would be buried so deep an army with shovels could never dig it up. Even rumors would be plastered over. It had happened before. The world and most sisters still believed Conrad had died in her bed. She had believed it. They had to have the Black Aja wrapped up and tied as near as possible before they dared risk going public. Maidani took up her report again once the Browns were safely past, but fell silent only moments later, when just ahead of them, a big pair in hand suddenly thrust aside a tapestry from behind. An icy draft swept out of the doorway that had been hidden by the tapestry's brightly colored birds from the drowned lands, and a heavy fellow in a thick brown work coat backed into the corridor, pulling a handcart stacked high with split hickory that another serving man in a rough coat was pushing from behind. Common laborers, neither had the white flame on his chest. At sight of Two Eyes Sedai, the men hastily let the tapestry fall back into place and wrestled their cart out of the way against the wall while trying to make their bows, almost toppling the load, which set them grabbing at the sliding firewood frantically while still bobbing. No doubt they had expected to finish their work without encountering any sisters. Yukiri always felt sympathy for the people who had to haul wood and water and everything else up the servants' ramps all the way from the ground, but she strode past them with a scowl. Talk while walking was never overheard, and the hallways in the common areas had seemed a good place to be private with Maidani. Much better than her own apartments, where any ward against eavesdropping would only announce to everyone in the Grey Quarter that she was discussing secrets, and far worse, with whom. There were only 200 or so sisters in the tower at the moment, a number the White Tower could swallow and seem. And with everyone keeping to themselves, the common areas should have been empty. So she had thought. She had taken into account the liveried servants rushing about to check lamp wicks and oil levels and a dozen other things, and the plain-clad workers carrying wicker baskets of the light knew what on their backs. They were always about in the early hours, readying the tower for the day, but they made hasty bows and curtsies and scurried to get out of a sister's way. Out of hearing, tower servants knew how to be tactful, especially since anyone eavesdropping on a sister would be shown the door. Given the present mood in the tower, the servants were particularly quick to avoid so much as a chance of overhearing things they should not. What she had failed to reckon on was how many sisters would choose to walk outside the quarters by twos and threes, despite the hour and the cold. Reds trying to stare down anyone they encountered except other reds, greens and yellows competing for the crown of haughty, and browns doing their best to outdo both. A few whites, all but one warderless, attempted to maintain a facade of cool reason while jumping at their own footfalls. One little group was not out of sight for more than minutes, it seemed, before another appeared. So Maidani spent nearly as much time chattering about points of law as she did giving her report. Worst of all, Twice Greys smiled in what looked like relief on seeing others of their Aja, and would have joined them had Yukiri not shaken her head, which infuriated her no end because it let all who saw know she had special reason to be alone with Maidani. Even if the Black Aja took no notice, and the light said there was no reason they should, too many sisters spied on other Ajas these days, and in spite of the 3 oaths, the tales they carried somehow grew in the carrying. With Elida apparently trying to force the Ajas into line by brute force, those tales too often resulted in penances, and the best to be hoped for was that you could pretend to have chosen to take it on for reasons of your own. Yukiri had already suffered through one such, and she had no desire to waste days scrubbing floors again, especially now that she had more on her plate than she knew what to do with. And taking the alternative, a private visit to Silviana, was no better, even if it did save the time. Elida seemed fiercer than ever since she began summoning Silviana for her own supposedly private penances. The whole tower was still buzzing with that. As much as Yukiri hated admitting it, all that made her careful how she looked at the other sisters she saw. Look too long, and you might seem to be spying yourself. Look too fast, and you looked furtive with the same result. Even so, she could barely keep her eyes from lingering on one pair of yellows, who glided along a crossing corridor like queens in their own palace. The dark, stocky warder following just far enough behind to give them privacy must have belonged to Pratala Nerbijan, a green-eyed woman who had largely escaped the Salveia nose, because Atuan Laraset had no warder. Yukiri knew little about Pratala, but she would learn more after seeing her in close conversation with Atuan. In high-necked gray slashed with yellow and a silk-fringed shawl, the Tarabona was striking. Her dark hair and thin, brightly beaded braids that hung to her waist framed a face that somehow seemed perfect as it was, without being beautiful. She was even fairly modest, at least as yellows went. But she was the woman Maidani and the others were trying to study without being caught out, the woman whose name they were afraid to speak aloud except behind strong wards. Atuan Laraset was one of only 3 black sisters Talim knew. That was how they organized themselves. 3 women who knew each other, 3 women who formed one heart, with each woman knowing one more the other 2 did not. Atuan had been Talim's one more, so there was some hope she could be followed to 2 others. Just before the pair passed out of view beyond the corner, Atuan glanced up the spiral hallway. Her gaze only brushed by Yukiri, yet that was enough to make Yukiri's heart leap into her throat. She kept walking, holding her face calm with an effort, and risked a quick glance of her own when she reached the corner. Atuan and Pratala were already well along the corridor, heading toward the outer ring. The warder was in the way, but neither was looking back. Pratala was shaking her head. Something Atuan was saying? They were too far from the room to hear any sound other than the faint click of the dark warder's boot heels on the floor tiles. It had just been a glance. Of course it had. She quickened her step to take her beyond sight if one of them did look over a shoulder, and let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding. Maidani echoed her faintly, her shoulders sagging. Strange how it takes us, Yukiri thought, squaring her own shoulders. When they first learned Talim was a dark friend, Talim had been a shielded prisoner. And she still scared us, spitless, she admitted to herself. Well, what they did to make her confess had scared them spitless first, but learning the truth turned their tongues to dust. Now Talim was tethered tighter than Maidani, closely guarded even if she did appear to walk free. How to keep a sitter prisoner without anyone noticing had been beyond even Sayarin, and she was pathetically eager to offer up every scrap she knew or even suspected in hope it might save her life. Not that she had any choice. Hardly an object of fear. As for the rest... Pavara had tried to maintain that Talim must be wrong about Galina Kazba, and went into a rage that lasted a full day when she finally was convinced that her red sister was really black. She still spoke of strangling Galina with her own hands. Yukiri herself had felt a cold detachment when Tamila Kinderode was named. If there were dark friends in the tower, it stood to reason some had to be Greys, though perhaps disliking Tamila helped. She remained cool even after she did the sums and realized that Tamila had left the tower at the same time that 3 sisters were murdered. That provided more names for suspicion, other sisters who had gone then too. But Galena and Tamila and the rest were out of the tower, beyond reach for the moment, and only the 2 could be proven dark friends. Atuan was right there, Black Aja without doubt, walking the tower as she wished, unrestrained and unbound of the 3 oaths. And until Doasim could arrange for her to be questioned in secret, a difficult matter even for a sitter of Atuan's Aja, since it could be a secret from everyone. Until then, all they could do was watch, a distant, carefully circumspect watching. It was like living with a red adder, never knowing when you would find yourself eye to eye with it, never knowing when it might bite. Like living in a den of red adders, and only being able to see one. Suddenly, Yukiri realized that the wide, curving corridor was empty ahead as far as she could see. The glance back showed only the others. The tower might have been empty, save for the 3 of them. Nothing in sight moved except the flickering flames. Maydani gave a small. Forgive me, he said. Where was I? Oh, yes. I understand that Celestine and Anharid are trying to find out their close friends in the Yellow. Celestine and Anharid are Celestine's fellow conspirators, both Yellows. There were 2 from each Aja, except the red and the blue, of course, which had proven very useful. I fear that won't be much help. She has a wide circle of friends, or did before the current situation rose between the Aja. A touch of satisfaction tinged her voice, however smooth her face. She was still a rebel, in spite of the added oath. Investigating all of them will be difficult, if not impossible. Forget her for the moment. It took an effort for Yukiri not to crane her neck, trying to look every way at once. A tapestry worked with large white flowers rippled slightly. She hesitated until she was sure it was a draft, and not another servant coming out of a servant's ramp. She never could recollect where they were located. Her new topic was as dangerous as discussing Atuan in its own way. Last night I remembered you were a novice with Elida, and close friends, as I recall. It would be a good idea for you to renew that friendship. That was some years ago, she replied stiffly, raising her shoulders and wrapping it around herself, as though she suddenly felt the cold. Elida very properly broke it off when she was raised accepted. She might have been accused of favoritism if I were in a class she was given to teach. As well for you that you weren't a favorite, Yukiri said dryly. Elida's current ferocity had its precedent. Pushed those she favored so hard that sisters had needed to step in more than once. Swan Sanche had been one of them. Strange to remember, though Swan had never needed rescuing from standards she could not meet. Strange and sad. Even so, you will do everything in your power to renew that friendship. Maydani walked 24 paces along the corridor, opening and closing her mouth, adjusting and readjusting her shawl, twitching her shoulders as though trying to shrug off a horsefly, looking everywhere but at Yukiri. How had the woman ever functioned as a Grey with so little self-control? I did try, she said finally, in a breathy tone. She still avoided Yukiri's eye. Several times. The keeper, Alviarin, always put me off. The Amerlin was busy. She had appointments. She needed rest. There was always some excuse. I think Elida just doesn't want to take up a friendship she dropped more than 30 years ago. So the rebels had remembered that friendship, too. How had they thought to use it? Spying, most likely. She would have to find out how Maidani was supposed to pass on what she learned. In any case, the rebels had provided the tool, and Yukiri would use it. Alviarin is out of your way. She left the tower yesterday, or maybe the day before. No one is quite certain. But the maids say she took spare clothes, so it's unlikely she'll return for a few days at the soonest. Where could she have gone in this weather? Maidani frowned. It's been snowing since yesterday morning, and it was threatening before. Yukiri stopped and used both hands to turn the other woman to face her. The only thing that need concern you, Maidani, is that she's gone, she said firmly. Where had Alviarin gone in this? You have a clear path to Elida's. Take it, and you will keep a close watch to see if anyone might be reading Elida's papers. Just be sure no one sees you watching. Talene said the Black Ajah knew everything that came out of the Amerlin's study before it was announced, and they needed someone close to Elida if they were to find out how it was done. Of course, Alviarin saw everything before Elida signed, and the woman had taken on more authority than any keeper in memory, but that was no reason to accuse her of being a dark friend. No reason not to, either. Her past was being investigated, too. Watch Alviarin as well as much as you can, but Elida's papers are the important thing. Maidani sighed and gave a reluctant nod. She might have to obey, but she knew the added danger she would be in if Alviarin did turn out a dark friend. Yet Elida herself still might be black, whatever Sarin and Pavara insisted. A dark friend as Amerlin's seat. Now that was a thought to pickle your heart. Yukiri! A woman's voice called from back up the hallway. A sitter in the hall of the tower did not jump like a startled goat at hearing her own name, but Yukiri did. If she had not been holding on to Maidani, she might have fallen, and as it was, the pair of them staggered like drunken farmers at a harvest dance. Recovering, Yukiri jerked her shawl and set her face in a scowl that did not diminish when she saw who was hurrying toward her. Siain was supposed to be keeping close to her own rooms, with as many white sisters around her as she could manage when she was not with Yukiri or one of the other sitters who knew about Talene and the Black Ajah. But here she was, scurrying down the hallway with only Bernila Gelbarn, a stocky Tarabonner, and another of Maidani's jackdaws for company. Leonin stepped aside and gave Siain a formal bow, fingertips pressed to his heart. Maidani and Bernila were foolish enough to exchange smiles. They were friends, but they should know better when they could not tell who might see. Yukiri was in no mood for smiles. Taking the air, Siain, she said sharply. Sarin won't be pleased when I tell her. Not at all pleased. I'm not pleased, Siain. Maidani made a small sound in her throat, and Bernila's head twitched, her multitude of narrow beaded braids rattling against one another. The pair of them took to studying a tapestry that supposedly showed the humbling of Queen Rhiannon, and for all their smooth faces, clearly they wished they were somewhere else. In their eyes, sitters were supposed to be equals, and so they were, normally, after a fashion. Leonin should not have been able to hear a word, but he could feel Maidani's mood, of course, and he moved a step farther away, while still keeping watch along the corridor, of course. A good man. A wise man. Siain had sense enough to look abashed. Unconsciously, she smoothed her dress, covered with snowy embroidery along the hem and across the bodice, but almost immediately her hands knotted in her shawl, and her eyebrows drew down stubbornly. Siain had been strong-willed from the day she first came to the tower, a furniture-maker's daughter from Lugard who had talked her father into buying passage for her and her mother. Passage for 2 upriver, but only 1 down. Strong-willed and confident, and frequently as blind to the world around her as any brown. Whites were often like that, all logic and no judgment. There's no need for me to hide from the Black Ajah, Yukiri, she said. Yukiri winced. Fool woman, naming the black right out in the open. The corridor was still empty in both directions as far as the curve allowed sight, but carelessness led to more carelessness. She could be stubborn herself when there was need, but at least she showed more brain than a goose about when and where. She opened her mouth to give Ciane a piece of her mind, a sharp piece, but the other woman rushed on before she could speak. Saren told me I could find you. Ciane's mouth opened and spots of color flared in her cheeks, at having asked permission or at having to ask. It was understandable for her to resent her situation, of course, just witless for her not to accept it. I need to talk to you alone, Yukiri, about the second mystery. For a moment, Yukiri was as puzzled as Maidani and Bernila looked. They could sham not listening, but that did not shut their ears. Second mystery? What did Ciane mean? Unless... Could she mean the thing that had brought Yukiri into the hunt for the Black Aja in the first place? Wondering why the heads of the Ajas were meeting in secret had lost its urgency compared to finding dark friends among the sisters. Very well, Ciane, Yukiri said, more calmly than she felt. Maidani, take Leonin down the hall until you can just see Ciane and me around the curve. Keep a sharp eye on anyone coming this way. Bernila, do the same up the hall. They were moving before she finished speaking, and as soon as they were out of earshot, she turned her attention to Ciane. Well? To her surprise, the glow of Sidar sprang up around the white sitter, who wove a ward against eavesdropping around the pair of them. It was a clear sign of secrets to anyone who saw them. This had better be important. Think about it logically. Ciane's voice was calm, but her hands still gripped her shawl in fists. She stood very straight, towering over Yukiri, though she was not much above average height herself. It's more than a month, almost 2, since Elida came to me, and nearly 2 weeks since you found Pavara and me. If the Black Aja knew about me, I would be dead by now. Pavara and I would have been dead before you and Doacine and Saren ever walked in on us. Therefore, they don't know about any of us. I admit I was frightened at first, but I have control of myself now. There's no reason for the rest of you to keep trying to treat me like a novice. A little heat invaded the comms, and a brainless one at that. You'll have to talk to Saren, Yukiri said curtly. Saren had taken charge from the start. After 40 years in the Hall for the Brown, Saren was very good at taking charge, and Yukiri had no intention of going against her unless she must. Not without the sitter's privilege, she could hardly claim the circumstances. As well, try to catch a falling boulder. If Saren would be convinced, Pavara and Doacine would come around, and she herself would hardly try to stand in the way. Now, what about this second secret? You do mean the Aja heads meeting? Ciane's face took on.
Alright, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.